grew up in the Channel Islands, come from Guernsey families, where we had an education that was quite old-fashioned. So there was the 11 plus. I passed that to go to a public school, and then I got a scholarship to go to Cambridge University. So it was, yeah, it was a good education. I ended up reading classics, and it turns out that the intelligence agencies recruit a lot of classicists from Oxbridge. So I don't know why, but they do. So come 1990, I applied to the Foreign Office because I quite fancy a career as a diplomat. And then I get this mysterious letter on Ministry of Defence notepaper saying we may have other jobs you find more interesting. So my initial gut response was, oh fuck, it's MI5. I don't know why. And it turned out I was right. But I was going to ignore it because all it said was, if you're interested, please ring this number. And at that point, MI5 had a really filthy reputation in the wake of the 80s scandals with Clive Ponting and Cathy Massiter and Spycatcher and everything, and the miners' strike. So I was going to ignore it because I just didn't want to get involved in something murky like that. And my father, who was an investigative journalist, became the editor of the newspaper in Guernsey eventually, and was also this huge spy aficionado. He loved John le Carré and things like that. Was in the room when I opened the letter, so he just said, oh, please ring it up, see if it is MI5, see if you're right. So that was that, really. 10 months later, I started working as an intelligence officer. And it was funny, because I remember when I was a child, watching, sitting up late with my dad, you know, it must have been like 11 years old or something, watching the Alec Guinness version of Smiley's People or Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and just thinking, God, this is grim. Who would want to live in a world like this, populated with these grey misfits, these depressive people? It was horrible. So that's why I was sort of quite anti-spy as well. It was the cultural thing that Dad seemed to find riveting. But anyway, I still fell into it. They approached me soon after massive reforms that were supposed to put them on a legal footing for the first time. So as I mentioned, they had this really bad reputation in the 80s because of the miners' strike particularly and the politicisation of intelligence. However, because of the whistleblowing scandals like Spycatcher, the law had been reformed in 1989. So there were two steps. One was the MI5 was put on a legal footing for the first time with the Security Service Act, which meant that for the first time in 80 years they officially existed, and that MPs in Parliament could ask questions about them. They couldn't actually investigate what they were doing, but you know, technically there was oversight. And also, as a counterbalance to that increased legitimacy, they reformed the Official Secrets Act in 1911, which was there to prosecute traitors, and they put in place the 1989 Act, section 1(1) of which specifically precludes whistleblowing and criminalises whistleblowing. So anyone who is a current or former intelligence officer for MI5 or any of the other intelligence agencies, and anyone who is a notified person for the purposes of the Official Secrets Act, which includes senior government personnel, people like the Prime Minister and the ministers, and spin doctors even like Alistair Campbell, will be notified for the purposes of the Act. If they breathe a word about their work, apart from to the agency with which they work, they are de facto breaking the law. So the 89 Act is very clearly there just to prevent whistleblowing. And that is proven again by the 1998 Act, the Public Interest Disclosure Act, to protect other whistleblowers, which specifically excludes intelligence and central government people. So it was a sort of bit of a quid pro quo in '89. Yes, MI5 became official, but yes, MI5 then got a lot more legal protection against disclosure. I suppose the best way I can describe myself at that point, I was 22, and I'd sort of come of age under Thatcher's Britain and everything. And I just found the whole political thing quite repulsive at that point because it had been so confrontational, you know, the left, the right, the unions being busted by Thatcher, all that sort of thing. So I was actually quite apolitical. I mean, I was quite happily embedded in classics and things like that, you know, the old political fights, not the modern. So when I was being recruited, they said specifically they wanted a new generation of intelligence officer. This is post the Berlin Wall coming down, the end of the Cold War. And therefore they needed people who could be recruited as counter-terrorism officers, not to do the old MI5 work, which was counter-espionage against the Soviet Union, and also counter-subversion, which is investigating Reds under the bed in the UK, and indeed extreme right-wing activity as well, I mean National Front and the BNP and things. So this sounded sort of interesting to me. I mean, the IRA was waging quite an efficient campaign at that point, and the idea of investigating, gathering evidence, putting people on trial, and potentially saving lives. I mean, you know, it sounded quite sort of idealistic in a way, you know, something that could potentially make a difference. I would not have wanted to get involved in the political side, but they said that was all over. So it was a bit of a shock that my first posting was to a very small section called F2, which was counter-subversion. And I was given the duty of investigating the Socialist Workers' Party, which is a Trotskyist group, not communists, so no chance of any support from a foreign power like, you know, the Soviet Union had been. And actually, I started learning about this group and thinking, why the hell are they being investigated? You know, what they're trying to do is achieve social change through democratic, leading to naturally evolving, potentially revolutionary steps. They're not subversive, they're not entryist, they're not subverting the state from within. They're trying to go about their democratic rights as citizens. So I really couldn't see the point. However, the justification for investigating subversion was decreasing rapidly because the Communist Party was no longer a threat, militant tendency was no longer a threat, and MI5 wanted to ramp up the threat from some subversive group in order to justify keeping its staffing levels up for a year or two until they took over primacy for investigating the Provisional IRA in 1992. So they found any excuse. They made us bump up the excuse to keep the staffing levels in place so that then they could move all the staff across to the Irish question when they took it over. That was corruption of the highest order, because by keeping the staffing levels looking at these small political groups, you are invading UK citizens' privacy needlessly to keep the staff levels up in MI5. How sick is that? So that was my first awakening, shall we say, to the fact that MI5 was not all rosy. I was very disillusioned by that and couldn't see the point. So I was actually seriously going to resign, thinking about resigning. In 1993, then I met my former partner, David Shayler, in the same section. So we started a relationship and it became easier just to sort of stay in the agency and build a life in London and all that sort of thing. So we sort of fell into another few years in MI5. And during that time, we had another 2 postings from F2, the subversion section, to the Irish section, and then to international terrorism. Now, we thought the F2 section was a historic throwback and the other sections would be better. But unfortunately, what we saw was actually worse problems developing. It was like a sort of process of boiling the frog. So things got worse and worse and worse rather than better. When you're an intelligence officer, you're moved every 2 years to a different posting. So we had 2 years in the counter-subversion section, F branch, 2 years in the Irish section, which was T branch then, and then final time in MI5 was in G branch, which was international terrorism. And David was the head of the Libyan section in G branch and developed an unusually close working relationship with his counterpart in MI6. Which, I mean, normally the 2 agencies hate each other and distrust each other and they don't get on. So it was unusual that he got on with PT16B, as he was known. And it also meant that he was officially briefed over a period of months about an unfolding plot, which involved PT16B and his boss PT16, sending large amounts of money over to fund an assassination plot against Colonel Gaddafi of Libya in 1996. And what basically happened was there was a walk-in, a volunteer, who walked into the British Embassy in Tunis in 1995, saying he wanted to speak to the local spook. That's where MI6 is always found. So he did, and it turned out he was a Libyan military intelligence officer who was then codenamed Tunworth, who said he had, to quote, a ragtag group of Islamic extremists in Libya, who then turned out, by the way, to be the nascent Al-Qaeda in Libya, and they wanted to try and depose Gaddafi, and they needed funding and planning to help that. And with very few checks, MI6 got terribly excited about this and started meeting Tunworth all over Europe, giving him, you know, 40 grand here, 40 grand there to fund this coup attempt. And David was briefed about this, as were his staff, by the way, all the way through, but thought it was one of these sort of mad MI6, you know, adventures that they would talk a big talk and never actually do anything. And he briefed his bosses as well and said, look, I'm really concerned about this. Should we be involved in this? And MI6 reassured him that it was okay because they had taken the case all the way to the top, as they called it, which meant they'd actually got it approved by their political master, the Foreign Secretary. That's what they told him. Now, it turned out afterwards from other investigations they hadn't. They'd lied to Sir Malcolm Rifkind, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time, who is now currently the chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee in Parliament, who should know, therefore, that he can be lied to by the spies. Anyway, that's a different story. So, in early 1996, David is sitting at his desk in MI5, and suddenly all this information's coming from different sources, saying there had indeed been an attack against Colonel Gaddafi. There had indeed been an explosion under a car in a cavalcade in which he was travelling, but the explosion had happened under the wrong car. Innocent people had died, and innocent people had been killed in the shootout afterwards. So we have here an operation that was illegal, it hadn't been cleared, it was immoral, and it was bungled, it went wrong, and innocent people died. How much more heinous can you get? So this is what we decided to resign over and we went public over. In terms of our concerns around all these issues over the years, it wasn't just us. Many of our peer group had the same concerns. Many of them resigned for the same reasons. But yes, we were good officers. We tended to get the performance-related pay and all that sort of thing, such as it was. And we were also seen as the awkward squad because we were always the types of people who were asking these questions and challenging. So yeah, anyway, most of us ended up resigning. Only David and I ended up going public. Well, actually, one other did in our support years later, but that's a different story. So, yes, of course, we raised all these things internally. And most often we were just told to shut up, not rock the boat, follow orders, and that was the sort of culture. And if you have a culture that is not only conform, but there is no external avenue whatsoever for ventilation, there's nowhere you can go, there's no oversight body, there's nothing that you can meaningfully go to apart from the head of that agency. You get this real pressure cooker sort of environment, a groupthink, which I think leads to more and more corruption. That's what we've seen with them skeltering down to involvement in terrorism again, or extraordinary rendition, or, you know, whatever. If there's no ethical ventilation, then the corruption becomes more and more distilled, and it's much easier for the people who don't rock the boat to set the tone, and that leads to these problems. So yes, we tried on the inside. We were told to follow orders, so we resigned to try something different. We left in late 1996, we resigned. David had already made contact with the journalists he was going to work with. He'd taken some documents to prove all this and given them to the journalists. And then there was a sort of very slow courtship for almost a year because there was distrust on both sides. He was worried they would shop him to MI5, and they were worried that it was some sort of sting operation by MI5 trying to plant fake intelligence and ruin their reputation or something. So it went on with, you know, call box telephones and, you know, burn phones and all that sort of thing, and odd meetings across London, until eventually, suddenly, the editor said, right, we're going to run it now, this weekend. So we had 3 days warning after all these months of waiting, this ramping up of tension. And there were indications as well that the spies were onto us. They were getting suspicious. So David had put out this false flag tale, really, is the best way of putting it, saying he was writing a novel. So if anyone heard anything about David talking to publishers or journalists or whatever, he just said it was about my novel. But there were still episodes that made us concerned. We became very paranoid about talking about anything in our flat, in our home. If we wanted to discuss anything, we'd just go out somewhere. So at that point, rather than being the people who would be listening into other people, we suddenly became very conscious of being the people being listened into. And that was in 1996, and I haven't felt private in my own home since. Before the story broke, we took legal advice about where we could go, where there would be less risk of extradition. So we actually did go on the run, like Edward Snowden. I can't think of anyone else who's preemptively gone on the run before an intelligence disclosure like that. And ironically, the two countries we were advised would be good were France, which is where we ended up, and that was right, that was good advice, and the US, because of their strong constitution. What whistleblower would go there now? I mean, you'd have to have a death wish. Anyway, so we ended up in France because it was closer to the UK and, you know, meant at least I could travel back, or so I thought, without being arrested. So we did preemptively flee, 12 hours ahead of the newspapers hitting the streets. So I do remember sitting on that plane thinking we're going to get arrested at some point before we get on the plane. And when it took off from the tarmac, it was just like, oh, phew, we're out, we're out, we're out. So that was a huge relief after months and months of stress. And we went literally on the run for a month. So around Europe, moving from hotel to hotel and sort of, you know, disguises and all that sort of thing. It was funny being the sort of gamekeeper turned poacher. We had no communication with our family in the run-up to it. Nobody knew. And we couldn't because we didn't trust our communications. We assumed our phones might be bugged and things like that. And we didn't want to warn them because if we had, and they were then arrested and questioned, we wanted them to be pristine, to be pure, to have known nothing. It was protecting them. And again, parallels with what Edward Snowden has said in public, that he didn't tell his family or anyone in order to protect them. It does give them legal deniability, obviously, if they know nothing. But of course, the obverse of that is that the first they hear about it is when they read the front page of the newspaper, which is a huge shock for any normal person. So, I mean, all the stories I had back from all our family, you know, how they heard about it, were appalling. I felt really bad about the stress they went through with that. And, you know, making the first phone calls from call boxes across Europe, saying, look, we're okay, we'll be okay. And they were so upset, and it was just awful. So the impact it had emotionally was bad. The impact it also then had as well, some of them were arrested on trumped-up charges around this case in order to provide leverage they could use against David Shayler. So it was more than just the emotional trauma, it was also legal ramifications and things. The chronology of the story comes in 3 parts, really. First of all, the first month where we were literally on the run around Europe, knowing that MI5 and the Metropolitan Police were after us, to the extent we found out afterwards that David did his first interview in a hotel in Amsterdam, I think it was, for Newsnight, in the Amstel Hotel, and there were inquiries to try and locate which hotel had that wallpaper in the background and things. It was that detailed. So we were sort of scooting around on these sort of international trains, trying to keep one step ahead, using different names and just cash and, you know, all that sort of thing. It was literally on the run. It was really frightening. Great way to lose weight, by the way. That worked really well. And then after a month, I knew I had to go back. I mean, I was just the girlfriend at that point. I'd done nothing wrong, but I knew I'd probably face arrest. So at that point, our lawyer was John Wadham. He was the head of Liberty then. He was great, and he flew out to Barcelona, which is where we'd ended up, and flew back with me to be arrested. I was turning myself in. And they knew that, and they still grabbed me at the immigration desk at Gatwick Airport and hauled me off, you know, 6 big special branch officers and things. So when I saw what happened to David Miranda, you know, Glenn Greenwald's partner, who got done under the counter-terrorism laws, brought back some memories, shall we say. So they grilled me for a day in a counter-terrorism suite in Charing Cross police station. Done nothing wrong, so they let me go, but they kept me on police bail for a month, for 6 months, so I had to keep going back to answer that. Anyway, so I had a week in the UK dealing with the traumatised families and trying to pack up our flat in Pimlico in London, which had been smashed up again in a counter-terrorism style raid, where they had pulled up the carpets and ripped the bath apart and smashed furniture, and everything was destroyed. And they found nothing of relevance, of course, because there was nothing of relevance. So I had a week in the UK and then went back to, I was told to get to a station in the middle of nowhere in the centre of France at the dead of night, and I would be met. And I was. So David met me, and he'd found this remote little primitive French farmhouse in the middle of nowhere where we hid out for 10 months. So it was quite strange. I'm not sure if they knew where we were. They tried to say afterwards, of course we always knew where they were, but I don't think they did. I think I know when they found out where we were, and that was a few months into it. But it was very, very primitive. 2 miles from the nearest village sort of thing. And we could have no car, because that would have required registration. We could have no TV or any media or anything, so it was quite stark. Very difficult as well, because we have all this pressure coming in on us, you know, all this media interest and things. And we're sort of stuck, just the two of us, in this remote place. The other problem with our whistleblowing, and this is something we could never have factored in 1,000 years, was that our story broke in August 1997. And for the first week, there was a lot of debate, you know, the usual stuff about he's a traitor, he's a hero, we've got to have an inquiry, blah, blah, blah. And then the government did what we expected them to do, which was to injunct the media and injunct David Shayler personally as well. So then, of course, you get the whole media, rather than saying he's a traitor, saying you can't injunct us, we're the free British media. We thought, great, we've got some support. And that was on a Saturday night, a Saturday. And then we woke up the next day to find that the headlines said Princess Diana had died in Paris that night. And that was the end of coverage for months. So that's when we found ourselves literally lost in this French farmhouse with no media support, no nothing. Eventually, come the summer of 1998, David pushed Panorama on the BBC to do an interview with him, a special about the Gaddafi plot, which had not been disclosed initially because the Mail on Sunday wanted to stand it up for themselves. So Panorama had this in the can, and then David went back to the Mail on Sunday saying, look, this is getting ridiculous. Come on, you've had enough time, just break the bloody story. So eventually they did. So we went up to Paris in August 1998. Under the terms of the injunctions that had been taken out against the media, the Mail on Sunday then had to submit the Gaddafi plot story to the government for clearance. And he did this on a Friday afternoon, the beginning of August 1998. Most civil servants would be gearing up for the weekend. 2 hours after the submission, there was an urgent extradition request to the French government saying, he's a super spy selling secrets to an enemy power, you've got to arrest him, we want to extradite him. And so the French sort of swooped on him, grabbed him off the street, and he disappeared into the legal system in Paris. Couldn't find him for 3 days. And then he was in prison for almost 4 months, awaiting the hearing about extradition. For most of that time, I wasn't allowed to see him because the French believed what the British said, he was a traitor. So he was put under a ruling called mise au secret, which meant he was held in isolation. When the French finally got the paperwork around the case, they realised actually what it was all about. He was a whistleblower. So suddenly everything relaxed. I could go and see him, his family could see him, it became much easier. And then we had the hearing, and then he was released, of course. So it was all theatrical, really. You know, the British, even most of the media said he was going to be extradited, but the French stuck to their legal guns and said, it's clear, you blow the whistle on these sort of matters, it is a political offence, we do not extradite for political offences. Clear. So the very early legal advice we'd had about where to go was absolutely right. France was a good place to be as a whistleblower then. Not sure if it would be now. Anyway, so then we were free. You know, he had to stay within France because if he'd gone to other countries in Europe, the Brits might have tried the same thing again to extradite him. But we could live very openly. We lived in Paris for 2 years, and more of the information came out. Information emerged anonymously from the CIA saying, yes, indeed, they knew about the Gaddafi plot and MI6 funding it. Information came out eventually from the DGSE as well, substantiating what he said. Documents appeared from MI6, substantiating largely what he said. And despite all this, the British government still said he was a fantasist and there was no need for an inquiry. So there has never been an inquiry. They've never taken his evidence about the Gaddafi plot. Not that it matters now, because of course the CIA and MI6 funded exactly the same groups in 2011 to depose Gaddafi, and this time they succeeded and killed him in the most violent way. And that was done openly, not in secret, the full glare of international media, and nobody cared then. So I think that displays terribly the moral journey we in the West have made from 1996, where it's a shameful secret, to we in 2011, where it's the war on terror, who cares? We had 2 years in Paris, living fairly openly, where all this other information was coming out, substantiating what he was saying, and watching journalists and student activists being arrested and prosecuted in some cases for these ongoing disclosures. So the ripple effect got bigger and bigger around this official secrets case. And then finally in August 2000, he voluntarily returned to stand trial, knowing he'd be charged with a breach of the Official Secrets Act 1989, but wanting his day in court so that he could read the Gaddafi plot into the public record, because the government kept denying it despite all this other proof coming out. So it was a calculated risk he took. When he came back to the UK, there was a series of pretrial hearings trying to determine what legally he could say in front of a jury without compromising national security, national interest, whatever. I mean, these ideas are always conflated anyway. And by the time he got in front of a jury in late 2002, charged only with the very early disclosures, not with the Gaddafi plot. It wasn't even mentioned in court. He wasn't allowed to say anything, pretty much. He couldn't cross-examine the witnesses from MI5. He couldn't say why he'd done what he'd done. He couldn't breathe the word Gaddafi plot because he would have been done for contempt of court, because the government took out injunctions, PIIs, government injunctions, for the duration of his 6-week trial, so that none of the British media could breathe a mention of the Gaddafi plot in case it fed into the jury's decision. So even though this story had been all over international media for, by that time, 4 years, for those 6 weeks, the Gaddafi plot didn't officially exist. I mean, it was just crazy. And then as soon as he was convicted of very, minor early disclosures, then everyone could start writing about the Gaddafi plot again. But for those 6 weeks, it did not officially exist. So it was quite Kafkaesque. And of course, because all they had to do actually under the law was prove he'd worked for MI5 and prove he'd spoken to someone outside MI5 about his work. Under the 89 Act, he was found guilty. That was a done deal, effectively. He was charged 3 times, so he was facing technically 6 years in prison. But he ended up with 6 months. And the jury, some of them were in tears when the guilty verdict came in. They knew. I mean, they remembered. But they couldn't not follow the orders of the judge, which is, if that's the case, he worked there and he said this, he's guilty. So it was very, very difficult to live through that stress. I mean, an Old Bailey trial for 6 weeks is intensely stressful. And then you have to deal with the media coverage afterwards. So again, you have a situation, you're sitting there watching the journalists write down the official ruling at the end of the case. Shayler did what he did in what he thought was the public interest. There was no financial motivation and no lives were put at risk by his whistleblowing. And yet the headlines the next day said precisely the opposite. Shayler sells agent lives down the river for money. And that was almost more of a moral rape than being found guilty and going to prison, for a few months. To have his reputation shredded in that way and misconstrued in that way was far more damaging for far longer. I mean, it haunts his life. It will haunt his life forevermore. And that's why they did it. I mean, this is a pattern you see with all big intelligence whistleblowing cases, that there's this initial flurry of excitement. Oh, we've got a new toy to play with from the media, usually. That's how they see it. Oh, we can make our careers on the back of this really sexy story or stories. And it's the gift that just keeps giving for the journalists. But for the whistleblower, after the initial excitement dies down and there are legal proceedings, and you get the grind of government spin and you get the grind of the intelligence agency spin working away at the mainstream media, drip, drip of little bits of poison. Oh, well, he was overlooked for promotion, or he was too junior to know what he was talking about, or he was sacked, or he was disgruntled. All the usual phrases they use for every single whistleblower that comes out of the intelligence agencies. And if they keep dripping this poison in long enough, people generally start to believe it. So initially you're a hero, you're a whistleblower, and then, this attrition goes on. And the longer it goes on, the longer the case goes on, the more the attrition sets in. So for David's case, for example, I mean, it started for us in 1996 and it ended in 2003 when he'd served his sentence. That's 7 years. It's a long time for this drip, drip of poison. And for the whistleblower himself, I mean, one, you're a hero, and on the other hand, you're a traitor. And that duality is very, very hard to live with, particularly because people then say, oh, you do it for money, or you do it for glory, or you're a narcissist, or whatever it is. And actually what you're doing is living on your wits and on your nerves, on the breadline, with no prospect of any future employment or any normal life afterwards. The pressure from every which way is very intense. And I know that's the case for every whistleblower. Coming out of any sector, they face that vilification, they face the loss of professional standing and professional income and everything. But for intelligence and central government and military whistleblowers particularly, there is that de facto criminalisation and the full weight of a national, if not an international, community of intelligence pushing back at you. you've got to have a moral conscience as a functioning democratic citizen. You know, just because something is the law doesn't mean it's morally right, and the law is constantly evolving. So if the intelligence agencies start going down a moral slide and doing things which are not only immoral but actually demonstrably illegal, like kidnapping and torture and fabricating evidence to go to illegal wars, there is a duty as a citizen, I think, and duty as a moral human being to try and effect change from that. And anyone who thinks that just following orders is a defence is a throwback. And things have got so bad, people don't trust the political classes anymore, they don't trust the big corporations. So I would suggest that the whistleblower is the regulator of last choice, last defence. We have to rely on that. We have to rely on them to try and keep any semblance of democracy going now.